Shit weekend. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So bad. So bad.
Can a single radio phrase reveal the internal collapse of a Formula One team? Charles Leclerc shouted at us in Singapore, and Ferrari does not have how to cover it. This is much more than frustration. It is a warning. The night in Singapore has always been a special scenario for Charles Leclerc. Not only because of the glamour of the urban circuit illuminated under the artificial lights of Marina Bay, but because historically, it has been one of the places where his talent has been clearly shown. Here he achieved memorable poles. Here he built part of his reputation as an exceptional classifier. In this narrow, technical and treacherous route, the precision is paid with gold, and Leclerc used to convert each curve into a work of art. But what happened in the classification of the 2025 Singapore Grand Prix was exactly the opposite of a work of art. It was a nightmare painted red. Instead of pole, Leclerc finished 7th. And that position in another context could have been a bad more day, a passing discomfort. But not this time. Because this result represented the tip of the iceberg of a weekend that had been falling down little by little since Friday. And the drop that filled the glass was the final radio communication. When his engineer Brian Botzi told him coldly his position, P7 in the end, Hamilton P6 there was no pause to process. Leclerc's response was automatic, as if he had rehearsed it in his head while fighting back after return with a car that did not answer. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So bad. So bad. Shit weekend. The words came out as if it were difficult to admit what I was living. While saying it, the cameras captured him by hitting the steering wheel, a spontaneous gesture that revealed much more than frustration. It was helpless. It was contained rage. It was the reflection of a pilot who knows that he has more, that he can do more, but that is tied to a car that is not up to his ambition. And that emotion was not accidental. It was the result of accumulated wear. From the FP2 things did not work. But Leclerc is not someone who surrenders to the first. He tried to adapt. He tried to modify his piloting. He even tried to justify his team's decisions. But the SF25 did not accompany him at any time. Each curve was a negotiation with a chassis that did not convey trust. Each acceleration was a lottery. And in a circuit where errors are paid with walls, that is a competitive death sentence. That radio message was not just a lament. It was a cry. One that broke with the usual political correction of modern pilots. Leclerc, usually content and diplomatic, dropped a truth without filters. And that made him one of the most human moments of the season. Because all once have been there, frustrated, exhausted, trapped in a situation that we cannot control. Leclerc only had a microphone to shout it and the world heard. And what we listened to was devastating. Ferrari not only lost a competitive opportunity in Singapore, he lost something deeper, the emotional trust of his most emblematic pilot, the one who should be his banner, your leader, your weapon to fight for the title. At that exact moment when he said, shit weekend, what I was really saying was, I don't know how much I can continue like this. And when a pilot like Leclerc reaches that point, everything else begins to stagger. To truly understand Charles Leclerc's emotional outbreak on the radio, you have to go much further back in the weekend that I end the first training session. Ferrari seemed to have a clear direction. The car showed a solid base, the times were competitive, and both Leclerc and Hamilton reported acceptable sensations. But it was in the FP2 where everything changed. Instead of evolving with the track as their direct rivals did, Ferrari opted for an aggressive modification in the setup. The intention was clear: to gain traction efficiency, improve the slow curve, and prepare the car for thermal degradation in long batches. But the result was a radical loss of balance. This was not a simple ailer modification or suspension height. It was a fundamental alteration in the rear aerodynamic configuration and the differential. Ferrari opted for a compensation strategy, to release rear load to reduce straight drag, but with the promise that rear tires would endure. They did not. Leclerc, from that point, found an indomitable car. Each attempt to find adhesion leaving curves such as 8 or 13 ended in landslides. The SF25 was not only slow at the exit, but its behavior was erratic. The rear axle did not convey confidence, and this forced Charles to continuously modify his driving style, delaying acceleration points, braking before and compromising paths that he would normally dominate naturally. But the coup de grace came when they began to analyze comparative telemetry data with McLaren. The SF25 lost almost 0.2 between curves 7 and 13 with respect to Oscar Piastri, a direct rival. Not due to piloting errors, but by a structural difference in the way cars delivered power when leaving curve. The McLaren managed to heat the tires uniformly, generating progressive traction. Ferrari, on the contrary, overheated the rear compounds to the first thrust attempt, quickly entering a critical thermal degradation zone. And if this were not enough, the third part of the circuit, the final stretch, finished sentencing the classification of Leclerc. In curve 14, a key point to close back in Marina Bay, Charles lost up to 0.372 seconds. Not because I stopped before, but because I simply could not forcefully accelerate at the exit. Telemetry was devastating. 8 km/h less speed in curve, and a complete accelerator application that came fractionally, delayed, and constantly interrupted by over-waver corrections. At that point, Leclerc knew there was nothing to do. His frustration was not just because of the result. It was to know that the car had potential, that the team had taken a promising path, and abandoned it for a poorly founded bet. And here a key question arises. Why did Ferrari insisted with that configuration when all the data contradicted it? Why didn't they go back when it was still possible? The answer seems to be double. On the one hand, an excess of confidence in its internal simulations. On the other, an almost obsessive need to innovate to reach McLaren, although that meant going beyond the safety margin. The tragic thing is that Leclerc saw the disaster come. He felt it from the second practice. He warned it in technical meetings. But the team insisted. And when a pilot realizes that his warnings are not heard, he begins to feel that he does not pilot a car, but an alien-imposed strategy disconnected from his reality on the track. That is the true context of his explosion. It wasn't just disappointment. It was the accumulated fatigue of not being heard. It was the despair of seeing how his weekend collapsed in front of his eyes without being able to do anything to avoid it. When Charles Leclerc pronounced those words on the radio, unbelievable. So bad. Shit weekend, many stayed with the superficial impact of their frustration. But what came later was even more revealing. During post-classification interviews, already without a helmet, already with the face still marked by the anger, Leclerc dropped another lapidary phrase. It was a stupid experiment. And there changed everything. When Leclerc speaks of experiment, he does not do it in abstract. It refers to a series of adjustments introduced by Ferrari after the first free session that radically altered the car's behavior. Changes that, in theory, had to prepare SF25 to be more competitive in the critical phases of the classification. But that, in practice, made him an unpredictable beast. This is where the most delicate part of the matter enters. Because within Ferrari, the concept of experimentation is not new. For several seasons, the team has used free sessions to validate different configuration, aerodynamic, and suspension behavior philosophies. On paper, it seems a logical strategy to collect more data, explore solutions, gain flexibility. But in practice, this approach has generated a constant disconnection between simulator data and real track behavior. And in Singapore, that disconnection became unacceptable. Leclerc was not simply questioning a bad decision. He was accusing the team of having compromised his weekend for trying something that should not have been tested in classification. And that, within a structure as hierarchically and politically tense as Ferrari, is a serious accusation. Because it implies that the technical decisions were made by ignoring the pilot's sensations. That the theoretical data on real perception was prioritized. That, once again, he fell into the old sin of Maranello. Listen more to the simulations than the man behind the wheel. But the symbolic burden of that stupid experiment goes even beyond the technical. It is a criticism of the current Ferrari culture, to the lack of clear leadership, to the continuous search for miraculous solutions without consolidating a stable base. Because when a pilot begins to feel that he is part of an experiment, he loses his role as protagonist. It goes from being the center of the project to being a test subject. And that is exactly what Leclerc was denouncing. That his role as a team leader was being blurred. That their experience, their driving style, their warnings, were being underestimated by decisions that responded more to engineering impulses than to a career logic. It is here that the impact of his words becomes much deeper. Because saying stupid experiment, Leclerc is drawing a line in the sand. He is demanding that Ferrari change his approach. Let it improvise. That begins to build a car around your pilots, not around graphics and abstract predictions. When a Leclerc-caliber pilot, in his sports maturity, in the peak of his career, he begins to raise the voice in public with that forcefulness, it means that the internal route is broken. And that, in a team like Ferrari, can have devastating consequences. Ferrari is in front of a mirror. You have to look honestly. Do you want to continue that team that promises a lot and delivers little? Or will you really protect your greatest asset before it's too late?